Good morning. Welcome to Pause for Thought number 5. Today we are going to be taking a look at one of the works by C.S. Lewis. You might have heard that name. He's very well known. He's written a number of books considered to be Christian classics. If you remember back to your childhood, you might recognize the titles The Chronicles of Narnia, which is one of his children's fantasy works. He has also written another classic by the name of Mere Christianity, which is one of his apologetic books. If you don't know what apologetics is, it is the reason and defense for why Christianity as a faith makes sense. And even though it was written in 1952, it is still considered today to be one of the best apologetics books. And if you're interested in apologetics, you will be encouraged to read that. It is still considered to be in the top 10 books. Then the one that we're going to read from today is the Screwtape Letters. It's one of his fictional works. I love it because it's very tongue-in-cheek, sort of, but still extremely relevant for today. In this book, a senior demon named Screwtape writes 31 letters to his nephew, Wormwood. Wormwood is very young and very inexperienced in the art of tripping Christians up, so to speak. So Screwtape writes him advice on how to deal with the person in his charge, which is called a patient, and shows him how he can guide him towards our Father below, which is their father, which is Satan. And he needs to keep the patient away from the enemy, which is our Heavenly Father. So it's a series of letters, and it sounds strange, but it's amazing how even though it's 70 years old, how the points that are raised will sound extremely familiar, even if a few of the other things, like referring to the number 37 double-decker bus, might not be within your field of experience. But it's a fun book, makes you think quite hard. So I'm hoping that at the end of this, when we ask some questions, you'll have had something to think about. So sit back and enjoy as I read the first 2 letters from Screwtape to Wormwood. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialistic friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you supposed that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. If it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about inside his head. He doesn't think of Christian doctrines as purely true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think of materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous. That is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too, whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I'm suggesting, the enemy has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of paying attention to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experience. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not, like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat there reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years of work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I am not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control, and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy presumably made a counter-suggestion. You know how you can never quite overhear what he says to them. That this was more important than lunch. At least I think that's what must have been said. For when I said quite, in fact too important to tackle at the end of the morning, the patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past. And before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got him into an unalterable conviction that, whatever odd idea might have been in the man's head when he was shut up alone with his books in the museum, a healthy dose of real life was enough to show him that that sort of thing just couldn't possibly be true. He knew he'd had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense of actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. You begin to see the point? Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home to him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean real science, as a defense against Christianity. That will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't see and touch. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real-life stuff.
But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the result of a thorough investigation. Do remember you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was your job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
My dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your better moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now back with us. All the habits of the patient, both mentally and bodily, are still in our favor. One of our great allies at present is the Church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the Church as we see her, spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. But fortunately, it is quite invisible to those humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local shopkeeper, with rather an oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts and a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad, and in very small print. When he gets to his pew and looks around, he sees just the selection of his neighbours whom he has up until now been avoiding. You must lean pretty heavily on those neighbours. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It means very little, of course, what kind of people the next queue really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior on the enemy's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool. Provided that any of those neighbours sing out of tune, have squeaky boots, or double chins, or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind, which he supposes to be spiritual, but which, in fact, is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armour and bare legs, and the mere fact that other people in church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious, difficulty to him. Never let it come to surface. Never let him ask what he actually expected them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity to amuse yourself by producing in him the particular kind of clarity which hell affords. Work hard, then, on the disappointment and anticlimax which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a Christian. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavour. It occurs when the boy who has been enchanted in the nursery by stories from the Odyssey by Homer buckles down to really learn Greek.
It occurs when lovers have got married and begin the real task of learning to live together. In every department of life, it marks the transition from dreaming aspiration to laborious doing. The enemy takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word that he uses. With his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural relationships with this two-legged animal. Desiring their freedom, he therefore refuses to carry them, by their mere affections and habits, to any of the goals which he sets before them. He leaves them to do it on their own, and there lies our opportunity. But also remember, there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotions and therefore much harder to tempt. I have been writing to you on the assumption that the people in the pew afford no rational ground for disappointment. Of course, if they do, if the patient knows that the woman with that absurd hat is a fanatical bridge player, or the man with squeaky boots is a miser and an extortioner, then your task is so much easier. All you then have to do is to keep out of his mind the question, if I, being what I am, can consider that I am in some sense a Christian, why should the different vices of those people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention? You may ask whether it is possible to keep such an obvious thought from occurring even to a human mind. It is, Wormwood, it is. Handle him properly, and it simply won't come into his head. He has not been anything like long enough with the enemy to have any real humility yet. What he says, even on his knees, about his own sinfulness is all parrot talk. At bottom, he still believes he has run up a very favorable credit balance in the enemy's ledger by allowing himself to be converted, and thinks that he is showing great humility and condescension in going to church with these smug commonplace neighbours at all. Keep him in that state of mind as long as you can. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.